This lecture is about the High Renaissance. Now, by High Renaissance, we mean when the movement has really come into its own. It's widespread, widely accepted, and is permeating all aspects of, or many aspects at least, of culture in the 15th and early 16th centuries, both within Italy as well as in other parts of Europe. So what is the High Renaissance? Well, it's when, as I mentioned, Renaissance ideals take hold and become widespread. Another characteristic of the High Renaissance is that the culture, the center of culture, moves from Florence to Rome and Venice and throughout Europe, but specifically that the Pope and the papal court become some of the major patrons of artistic creation, specifically Pope Julius II and Pope Leo X, who support many of the most famous artists of the High Renaissance, especially Michelangelo, Josquin the musician, and Raphael the painter. And the arts reach a high point during the High Renaissance, and these artistic values permeate all the arts and indeed many aspects of society. The first piece we're going to look at is a musical selection by Josquin des Prez, who was considered to be the Michelangelo of music, the greatest composer of the High Renaissance. He was the conductor of the choir at the papal court and was a famous composer, famous conductor, had a huge influence on the development of Renaissance music. And one of the major developments that he came up with, or that he used in his music, was imitative counterpoint. Now, counterpoint is a type of polyphony, a type of multiple parts of voices, multiple voice parts, where each voice takes a certain melody and sings it. We have something similar to this in terms of rounds that we do. Row, row, row your boat, for example, where someone starts and then the next person starts a little bit later. That's kind of the idea behind imitative polyphony. And here, all the voices are equally balanced. There is no melody part and people singing backup, but each voice takes turns being in the spotlight. So the theme is passed from voice to voice. And so the music takes place not just reading horizontally across the page, but also vertically. The parts have to line up with each other. As each voice enters, it has to sound harmonious. And that was one of the main emphases of music in the Renaissance, was its eloquence, that it needed to sound pleasing to the ear. That it wasn't enough for it to just be well written or logically okay, but it had to make a lot of sense. And so the piece that I've chosen for you to listen to is Josquin's setting of Ave Maria, which is a famous Catholic prayer. And notice, if you want to look at the graphic here on the page, you can see that the soprano line, the highest line, is going to start out with the melody. And then 2 measures later, the alto line takes up the same melody in the same key. So you have a sort of echoing effect and layering upon layering. So as you listen to the piece, you might want to look at this first page and see how it plays out. But pay attention to the way that the voices are balanced and the way that the voices join together harmoniously. All right, well, how do these ideals translate into the visual arts? Well, one famous example of this is in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. This was a huge endeavor for Michelangelo, especially because he never considered himself to be a painter. He first and foremost was a sculptor. As we've seen in his earlier works, that's where his heart lay, that's where his training was. But Pope Julius II insisted that Michelangelo be the one to paint the chapel ceiling. The walls had already been painted by famous artists from the early Renaissance, such as Perugino, Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, but the ceiling was completely empty. Now, as we look at this graphic, you can see that there are all sorts of architectural divisions between the paintings that Michelangelo has created. Those architectural divisions are painted on. They don't exist. What Michelangelo was given was a big blank ceiling, and he had to find a way to organize it. And so what he did is he divided it into these architecturally separated sections, each of which has its own painting in it. And so by creating this illusion of architecture, he was able to organize it, balance it, make sure that it was ordered. And these paintings move from earth to heaven, from the animal nature of man to the divine. They move from Noah's drunkenness, all the way to the creation. And so what happens is they move from chaos to order, which is a typical Renaissance movement. Now, there's a great book about this called Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling by Ross King, and it's very readable. And he dispels a lot of myths about the Sistine Chapel ceiling. First of all, Michelangelo did not paint this lying down. Instead, he created a very elaborate scaffolding system so that he could lean against it and be able to see what he was doing and paint it more vertically. One of the most famous panels from the Sistine Chapel ceiling is the painting of the creation of Adam. And it's a beautiful painting, as you can see. First of all, I want you to pay attention to the way that the painting, the fresco, is balanced into two sides. Let me just mention something about fresco painting. Fresco painting would mean that the pigment or the coloring was mixed in with wet plaster. So it allows for beautiful colors, but it's very difficult to work with because once the plaster has dried, there's no way of retouching the painting or going back and making changes as there is with other media like tempera or oil painting. And so it shows the virtuosity, the skill of the artist. Now, if you look at this painting of Adam, the creation of Adam, and if you know the biblical story, you probably notice that there's something strange about this. In the Bible, there's no mention of God creating Adam through the touch of his hand. But here, God, in his cloud, surrounded by angels, reaches out to touch Adam's finger, to pull him forth out of the rock. And Adam is sculpturally much like a classical nude, much like the classical statues of Greece and Rome. So Michelangelo is ever the sculptor, even as he's painting frescoes. And you can see that this human-like God uses his hand as the instrument of his creation, much in the same way that Michelangelo himself uses his hands as the instruments of his creation to bring forth life, to bring forth beings out of the stone. This is taking place in an ideal realm. This is nowhere in Italy or Florence or anything like that. But it allows us to focus on the act of creation itself, and that God here is an artist. The artist, like Michelangelo, is a co-creator with God. Now, there's been some debate about this cloud that God is floating in. Some anatomists say that it has the same shape as a human brain and make reference to Michelangelo's secret dissections of cadavers. And I'm not sure whether that's true or not, but it's an interesting idea to think about art as an intellectual pursuit, as a pursuit of the brain, not just of the hand. And that helps to understand the rising status of the artist in the Renaissance. It's not just manual labor, it's intellectual labor, it's spiritual labor that requires genius. Another painting example, visual art example of high Renaissance art is Raphael's Madonna of the Meadow. And I wanted to bring this up because it captures some of the things we were talking about, or I was talking about with Michelangelo's work, but I think it makes it a little easier to see. First of all, again, this is a religious theme, as we saw in Josquin's Song and Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, and in fact, much Renaissance art is religious in nature. Raphael is famous for the sweetness, dolcezza of his figures, that they seem very lifelike here, that he's made Mary and the Christ child and little John the Baptist holding his staff to seem real, to seem like actual people. And you can notice that the way that this painting is created is very balanced again. Mary's head makes the top of a triangle, her outstretched foot and John the Baptist create a full triangle. And these kinds of geometric forms were very, very popular in high Renaissance art because of the sense of stability that they created. Now, to move from visual arts to architecture, let's look at this Tempietto by Bramante, who was one of the foremost architects of the high Renaissance. And if you look at it for a little bit, hopefully you can see that it shares many of the same characteristics as the music and the visual arts that we've just looked at. It's balanced, it's stable, it uses straight lines, geometric forms, round circles, rectangular forms. There's nothing in here that's incomplete or unstable. It's very simple at the same time, borrowing from the classical architectural forms, columns, and a walkway and domes and that sort of thing. With here at this point, at least it's simple stone. It probably would have been painted at the time that it was created, but like so much classical architecture, it has come down through time, being more simple. But you can see here again the emphasis on balance, order, stability. All right, to move from the visual arts to literature, the example I want to pull on for this is Castiglione's book of the Courtier, which was extremely famous, very widely read through the Renaissance. And it presents itself as a conversation between courtly gentlemen and ladies about what the ideal courtier would be like, what the ideal courtly lady would be like. And the ideals that Castiglione presents in this book are balance. Sound familiar? That the ideal courtly gentleman would be balanced. He would know how to fight, but not too well. He would be able to dance, but not too much. Everything he does is within certain bounds. And within this, Castiglione pulls on the idea of nonchalance. And the word that he uses for this is sprezzatura. That whatever the courtier does, it needs to seem effortless. It needs to seem natural. And that emphasis on seeming is important, that it's about the appearance. It goes back to that idea of eloquence that I mentioned with Josquin's music, that Renaissance arts, the ideal for Renaissance arts is that they seem natural, that they don't seem to have required great effort. Now, in deciding what the perfect courtly gentleman and courtly lady would be like, Castiglione's characters draw examples both from the classical past and from contemporary life, so their evidence is balanced as well. And in both cases, in the female courtly lady and in the male courtier, the emphasis is on their ability to judge, to read situations accurately, to know what's required. And so this is a sort of handbook for success. The profession of a courtier is becoming more prevalent within the Renaissance. And so this is a way for Castiglione to share some tips with those who might want to make it in court. So to sum up, High Renaissance arts are interested in order, ordered space, ordered sound, ordered ideas. And to create this order, they find a balance between the real and the ideal. So that most of the things that we see, Castiglione's courtier, for example, no one can really probably be that perfect. But by presenting an ideal, then people can adapt that to find what a real courtier would be like. So much of what we get in the Renaissance is idealized, is not like real life, but is instead to be an inspiration for real life. We see the use of rich, realistic color, and that translates into music in terms of simple, beautiful, melodic lines, not highly ornamented like much of the late medieval music was, but much more simple, easy to listen to. Classic human forms in architecture, universal themes, and through all of these arts, the focus is on eloquence, on making something beautiful.